Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So I sat here and I was doing a video on Joe Manchin and the TYT interview. And midway through it, I was kind of struck with this question of sorts. How long do you want your country to remain this way? I will repeat it. How long do you want your country to remain this way? What I mean by that is, the debate that we have in Washington is somewhat contrived. They're not talking about real things. What I mean is, if you're looking at the left and the right, what they consider to be the left and right, the far left and the far right. And by far left and far right, I just mean people who actually believe in things. people who aren't robots. People who look at the world and give their honest appraisal of the world. Not necessarily what the party tells them, but for the most part, what they themselves believe. Now, what I mean by that is they're being honest. They're just earnest people. If you go down the list, foreign interventionism, Donald Trump ran with this idea of, and when I'm saying going down the list, when you go down the list of items that these people talk about and items of things that these people agree on, it's a pretty detailed list. It's a pretty detailed list. And I'm using a comparison to what Donald Trump ran on. Now, Donald Trump was essentially Obama for Republicans. He ran on this idea of, instead of hope and change, I want to make America great again. But it's the same flowery rhetoric of what this country is, but it's built for a Republican audience. I'm making this point, though, that what he ran was against Republican dogma. For the longest time, the public, for the most part, have been told that you had all of these Republicans who were just these staunch individualists. That even though, for the most part, the people who they're voting for made their life much more harder and gave their money away to people who didn't necessarily deserve it. And when I deserve it, I mean funnel it to the top. They still voted for these guys because these guys had these somewhat principles that worked contrary to their best interests. Now, Trump running destroys that myth. It destroys that myth. What I mean is, foreign interventionism, they didn't like it. Trump was against it. He wants to be conciliatory with Russia. He wants to essentially shake hands around the world in that sense. Purely, now granted, with this perspective of America first, but I'm just saying, we're sick of these foreign wars. We're spending $1 trillion murdering people abroad. Can we use that money for us? Meaning the people who are the workers, who are making this country move, who get the light, keeps the lights on, who actually do the labor. Shouldn't that money be reserved for the people who are doing the labor? Shouldn't those resources be used for us? Again, not necessarily to kill and murder people abroad. Yeah, somebody's making a profit off of that $600, $700 trillion that we're spending on military. It's not us. It's not us. So yes, they were against foreign interventionism. Progressive position, check that off the list. And by progressive, I'm just saying leftist. I'm beginning not to like this word. But the leftist position. Infrastructure spending. Again, another agreement. Ultimately, Donald Trump ran around the country saying he was going to do infrastructure spending. Now, leftists will say, if you're going to spend that money, spend it on something worthwhile. Have a green energy new deal. Revitalize the infrastructure in this particular country. This country is woefully behind in regards to infrastructure. Well, if you're talking about high-speed rail or even newer technology like maglevs and all these other things, we're not the shining city on the hill. And if you look around the globe, oh man, we are woefully behind. If you're going to spend that money here. The Green New Deal gets you two things. Whether or not you care about global warming, whether or not you care about ecology, at the very least, you would want a cleaner environment. Cleaner air, cleaner water. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you're making this point of, okay, we're transforming our energy into one that's just a better environment, meaning these jobs that are being created here in the United States, and they're going to be well, decent paying jobs. A new deal. It's called a Green New Deal, but it's still a new deal. And it's giving you easy reason. I mean, the argument itself makes itself in regards to why the energy spending is a decent idea. But again, it's still the agreement on infrastructure spending. Increase the minimum wage. Donald Trump ran saying he was going to increase the minimum wage to like $10 an hour. It's not enough. But the fact that he came up and he was for it, again, runs contrary to Republican dogma. This is, again, another position where we agree. We may not necessarily agree on this specific number, but again, in a Venn diagram, we're in the same direction or same ballpark. Protection of Medicare and Social Security, even the expansion of Social Security. Again, that's an area to which we agree. This is an area to which we agree. The majority of the country don't want them to touch Social Security or Medicare. And many, regardless of the side that you're on, want them to expand benefits for Social Security. A Venn diagram of agreement. Single-payer health care. Now, this one is tricky. 53% of Republicans are on board for single-payer health care. Now, I don't know what that number is in regards to the far left or whatever else. But I would make this point that I don't think necessarily that this is a hill you're willing to die on. If it's other issues that gets into your craw, I have a hard time believing that it's healthcare and providing healthcare for people. We may disagree on necessarily how, but if we're talking about data and you're being honest, single-payer healthcare is the thing that gets you there. Donald Trump ran around saying he was going to make sure everybody had healthcare. It was going to be cheaper. I don't think he said big, beautiful healthcare, but for whatever reason, that's what I have in my head. That's single payer. What he described was single payer. The only way that gets you what Donald Trump was promising everybody else was single payer. Free college. I don't know where they fall on that one. But I would wager that even if you made something saying, well, look, you have to do some kind of community service at the end of your term for 2 years. That's an agreement that we can make on. Anti-globalism, same thing. This idea of, look, these trade deals are raping jobs and income from this particular country. Yes, they're making our lives harder. You're allowing corporations to ship job overseas to people who are going to pay those people less. At the same token, bringing profits purely to the top, firing American workers to do it. I mean, it goes beyond that because these trade deals it goes beyond trade. It goes beyond trade to some degree of affecting the laws of a particular country. In a Venn diagram, that's a hell of a lot of belief. That's a hell of a lot of alliance on that front. Where we're going to bump heads is immigration. That's where we're going to bump heads. I'd argue that's not enough of a reason to toe a particular line. What I'm getting at is, and I'll ask the question again, how long do you want your country to remain this way? That's the operative question. You have a majority of society that, for the most part, agrees with the larger issues, or at the very least are in the ballpark of agreement. Why are those people in a political division? How do you get political divide when you have this much agreement? That's the question. That's the fundamental question. And I'd argue that the answer is pretty straightforward. Let me ask you this. Yes or no, do you believe that cash dominates the political process in this country? You have a capitalistic system. There is no way you can talk about the type of government that a person has, or the type of government, but not talk about economics. Those things are intrinsically linked. They're linked. People like to talk about, democracy and the economic system as being these two separate things. Those things are immensely linked. Now, we can have an argument on whether they should be linked, but your government is going to run on something. How's your government going to fund itself? How's your government going to create cash? How is your government going to allow commerce? Like, those things are intrinsically linked to the government itself. That's all I'm getting at. Do you believe that that particular government is free from corruption? Meaning, you have a system that runs on cash, and you have an incentive structure that essentially says maximize profit. You have people within an economic system that have accrued massive amounts of profit, who puts their money into the system, to the work of getting more. Meaning, if my job was to get more, if my incentive structure said I need to maximize my profit, I need to get as much as I possibly can, of course, at some point, your step is going to be to get into the political apparatus. You do that by essentially funding politicians. I'm either going to give this guy a lot of money, And this guy full well understands that the money he got was from me, and if he wants to get more of that money, he's going to do what I tell him to do. Or at the very least, he's going to lean heavily in my direction when something comes up, whether it's regulation, whether it's taxes, whatever else. He's going to lean in my way because he knows that he's going to get that money back. Or that I would run somebody against him, and I would spin ads against him, and I would do things to topple his particular office so I can put somebody else in who would do my bidding. That's our political system. 75, I think it was jolly. 75% of the time they spent asking for money. 75%. The system itself runs on cash. Politicians want to stay in office. So they would say one thing that's aimed towards the public itself while doing something completely different in regards to regulation, taxes, or whatever else. Some sort of policy that helps the people who are giving them the money itself. You're either going to be pushed by pitchforks or cash. There are no pitchforks. There are no pitchforks. People don't have time to get into the political process. For the most part, these people are barely making ends meet. They're drones. They're slaves working a plantation. They don't have time to necessarily look up. They have a ballet recital. They have something that the kid is doing. They have something that they themselves are doing in regards to sustaining themselves. But it's a hamster on a wheel. Do you have time to get off that wheel? And if you get off that wheel, how are you going to pay all the expenses and the debt to which you've accrued just by living a particular life? If that's your world, then that's your process. Then certainly that process is going to run based on the people who are paying them. Obama raised, what, 1 point something billion dollars. Hillary Clinton, 4 billion dollars or something. Money they just burned on the White House lawn. They're not raising their money from these plutocrats, out the kindness of these plutocrats' hearts. They're doing this because they're trying to influence the process, and they are influencing the process, which is why you have 2 right-wing parties in this country. If you have that political process, at the same token, those people need to get people to vote for them to get in office. So what do you do? What do you do? If you need money to get in, and the people who are paying you, the people who are essentially giving you cash, don't want you to talk about certain issues, because talking about certain issues adversely affects them. They're paying you not to say those things. So what do you talk about? You talk about identity. You talk about identity. So you have 2 parties, for the most part, that drawn out lines on this idea of identity. But because it's only 2 parties, it makes it seem like the argument they're having are extremes. Those arguments aren't extremes. Much of what should be talked about is not discussed. Those things are off the table. It is easier to have an ideological fight about identity than it is to actually talk about issues that will substantively change this country and put into action things that people actually agree on. That's what I'm getting at. The parties, both of which, of this political apparatus, are paid not to have these conversations. These conversations are things that, for the most part, people agree on, and you can come to some consensus. These aren't things they want to talk about. Talking about these things adversely affects their profits. You're not paid to do that. I'm giving you this $1.4 billion to not have that conversation, and not just not have that conversation. When you do have conversations on that every so often, to be, for the most part, to the right. That's what you're paid to do. So these issues to which we agree don't come up. What comes up is one party is for multiculturalism, the other party is not. Now, here's the catch. I have to be honest. I have a hard time understanding why somebody will vote against their own self-interest. Now, I understand it from a cultural standpoint. And I have to be honest, that's the only way I can understand it. As I said, most of these issues, for the most part, we agree on. Now, I'm not saying that somebody looks at this and says, well, you should vote Democrat, because Democrats, for the most part, again, don't talk about these issues. But certainly, voting Republican is like punitively hitting yourself in the face. So I have to ask myself, why is somebody doing that? Why would somebody do that? I think the answer goes back to, yeah, I think it's cultural. I think it's cultural. What I'm saying is that that's a hurdle that needs to be gotten over. And the parties themselves uses the multiculturalism thing, or cultural identity of sorts, as a replacement for talking about the issues that actually need to be talked about to move a society forward. That's what I'm getting at. Now, this doesn't necessarily start off nefariously. At least I don't think it did. I mean, you had the civil rights movement. You had essentially all the civil rights legislation being passed. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. You had LBJ saying we're going to lose the South for a generation. And they lost the South for a generation. Now, the catch is, Democrats hugged a Negro. They found the first Negro they can find and they hugged him. They hugged him tight. Now, whether you say that was purely for political ends or whether you say that the party just wanted to do the right thing. Either one, I don't necessarily care. I'm glad they did. This expanded to Hispanics. This also expanded to Asians and LGBTQ. So you had this one party that had this idea of multicultural. That was the identity of the party. You had this other party who was not, and who was alienated by the fact that particular party was multicultural, and that on some degree it made it feel as if something was wrong with them necessarily being them. Now, you've heard me say this country doesn't honestly regard itself. I don't believe it honestly regards itself in regards to culture and race and all these other things either. The only point I'm getting at is, for there to be this much agreement and yet this much divide in the country, and the only conversation that it seems that the parties are having are about identity, meaning that's the underlying subcurrent of conversation that we have. I'm saying that's manufactured. The moment that you start talking about economics, this stuff goes away. You have, yes, I would say the Republican Party has this cultural identity of sorts, and I would argue that the Republican Party itself, meaning the politicians, leverage that for wins. So they would say, hey, all those darkies and all those other people are over there because for the most part they're trying to get Democrats to vote for them. Democrats are just going to give them free stuff to get their votes. Now, at that point, you're weaponizing race. Race becomes a political weaponized factor. And for whatever reason, I would argue from a cultural standpoint, they believed it. That's the schism in your society. Now, the moment that you take this multiculturalism off the table, and the moment you start talking about real issues and real things, those issues goes away. That cultural schism goes away. I'm making the point that the cultural schism, this idea of talking about identity as being the only thing in the grand debate in this particular country, it's contrived. It's contrived. How long do you want your country to remain this way? And whether that's coming to some consensus of saying some agreement, some summit, or some kind of agreement on, yeah, these are the guys we'd vote for because these are the guys who are going to represent our interests. I don't give a shit if it's Republican or Democrat. This is the lowest bar we're willing to go. However that's done. I'm just making the point for the left and the right to agree on this much. It's insane to have this much division in the country. My argument is it's contrived. I don't think it's a real division. If you had somebody, say like a Sanders type, an Elizabeth Warren type, who's talking about economics, talking about their best interest, their bottom dollar and everything else, that you're no longer having this conversation about identity. Identity becomes something that floats away. And what takes the main stage are issues that deal with, hey, should we be murdering all these people abroad? Should we be spending $1 trillion to do it? Should we have healthcare in this system? Should Social Security be expanded? It starts having these conversations about things that actually address them, who they are, the things they need, they themselves. How do you move the country forward? The conversations that we're having right now in no way do that. They're staying with Russia for a reason. But understand, they're having this conversation about Russia even though you have a host of other issues. The majority of the country, if they got hit by a $500 bill, couldn't afford to pay it. Meaning if they had something that happened to their car, $500, couldn't afford it. Couldn't afford it. Like, the level of poverty in this particular country is astonishing. And yet, the conversation that we're having is about Russia. That's our politics. I'm just making a point that they're not doing that for shits and giggles. They're doing it because to have a conversation about real things adversely affects the people who are giving them cash. They're not going to mess that money source. And look, one last thing on this, and I'm going to end it because I think this has probably gone long. You're going to have many Republicans who go with this idea of freedom and all this other stuff. You're in a capitalistic system. Any idea of freedom, for the most part, is determined by the amount of your decision space. Cash is the determining factor in your decision space. What you eat, where you can go, where you go vacation, whether or not you must get back on the hamster wheel in the morning to go to your job. Whatever that is, your freedom is completely constrained by the amount of cash in your pocket. You can't have a conversation about freedom and democracy with half of the country in poverty. It's an insane conversation to have. Even to use the words goes, for the most part, without meaning. What you're talking about, if you're talking about freedom, you should be talking about real freedom. How do you get to have a life? How do you get to have a life? When they're talking about freedom and liberty and all this other stuff, they're not talking to you. They're talking to the people who are giving them money. The argument that they're making, saying those darkies over there are just being given money by the Democratic Party, that's why they vote Democrat. You understand the argument they're making for the tax cuts in that sense. That argument is spoken for you, but the argument is not necessarily for you. Ultimately, they just need to give you a reason to vote for something that's against your best interests. The tax cuts, you might get a few bucks back. The people who they're actually doing it for, the people who are giving the money to lower their taxes, is getting back millions, in some cases billions of dollars. That's you hurting yourself. That's you hurting yourself. I'm just making this point that understand the issue with the party are both of the parties. It's not one party or the other. These parties are not major extremes. These parties are modest extremes. All of these parties, for the most part, agree on the system the way it is. Status quo. These issues aren't brought up because, for the most part, these issues cost money. And somebody's going to have to pay for it. Neither party wants to deal with things that actually move this country forward. Both parties want to have these minor distinctions of conversations that they could blow up as being actual issues so they can avoid talking about the real things that matter. That's my point. I hope this didn't go too long. I just had that feeling of, how long do you want your country to be this way? Because that's ultimately the question that we're asking. These debates are insane. They're mindless. I get aggravated. And that this is our level of conversation. You have all these big issues that is affecting us and affecting the world itself as a whole. And we're sidelined. Meaning this country is, for the most part, sidelined on that debate. You have no influence in that debate because that's not even part of the debate that we're having in Washington. We're having a conversation about Russia. Nothing to get our house in order. Russia. That's our conversation. And that's our conversation because one party is completely busted, talking about the Democratic Party, and can't have an honest dialogue on why they failed so miserably and to this extent. And the other party, for the most part, is just paid by their donors. Every time the Democratic Party moved to the right, the Republican Party went further to the right. Democrats are your problem. That's the main problem in the system. If Democrats move further to the left, I will guarantee you the Republican Party would probably move to the left. They wouldn't have a choice. But again, it's the conversation that you're going to have. Are you going to talk about real things or just going to talk about identity? If it's identity, we all lose. So, alright guys, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to share, write, subscribe. You can always support the work through PayPal or Patreon. Thank you.